Hi, I'm Drew Levanti, and welcome back to Elections Weekly, a show where I take you on the tour of the week ahead through the lens of electional astrology. Thank you so much to everybody who's joined me for the first two episodes so far. I'm really excited to keep this going on a weekly basis. And thank you in particular to everybody who's commented, liked, and subscribed so far. It's really great to see the audience growing already. And especially, again, people who have commented with feedback on elections that they've actually used. It's great to see these charts coming into people's lives and giving them good results. So I wanted to shout out a couple of you who've given feedback on that so far. First up is Mackenzie. So Mackenzie used the Gemini Rising, Gemini Moon election from a couple of weeks ago, which Mackenzie had their eye on for a while, and used it to begin and announce their rebranding process, which started by changing all the social media handles. And Mackenzie says, originally I planned to do this after Venus and Mercury both went direct, but was getting very antsy about waiting. So I went for it and used that one. Extremely positive reception to the change, a nice flood of new followers, lots of messages about how perfect it was for me. And a few people reached out about booking multiple sessions of movement coaching. So I'd say solid overall. This is really great news. And I just wanted to highlight a couple things from Mackenzie's comment to show how it connects with the election that Mackenzie used. This idea of antsiness, these pesky retrogrades, right? How do we navigate retrogrades? And a lot of times people are really hesitant to have retrogrades in their elections or have stationary planets in their elections for understandable reasons, because we hear so much about these planets being about miscommunications or things going incorrectly or against our wishes. And I think that that is a little bit overblown, in particular with this for Mackenzie, where Mackenzie's doing a rebranding. And so if we look at this election, the ruler of the ascendant is about to station retrograde. It is about to go back over area that it's already been. And so re-articulating oneself, re-languaging oneself is something that resonates with a Mercury station or Mercury retrograde kind of theme. And because Mercury has other things going for it, like being in an air sign, having a strong ruler, these are all things that add up to a successful Mercury, even though it's stationary. Also, receiving the aspect from the moon is really nice. And the other thing from Mackenzie's comment that I wanted to highlight is this positive reception to the change. So I think we're definitely hearing the presence of Jupiter in the 10th house, and in particular, Jupiter in the 10th house that rules the 7th house. So with the 7th house being ruled by this Jupiter, that shows the importance of clients here. A few people reaching out about booking multiple sessions of movement coaching. So in other words, it's not just a career and reputation matter, it's career and reputation being advanced through one-on-one relationships, specifically clients. So this is a great use of this election, Mackenzie, and thank you so much for sharing. Next up is Emily. Emily shares, I used the second election to reach out to a potential mentor employer. So we're referring to this Cancer rising with the moon in Taurus and applying to an aspect with Jupiter. So Emily says, I got a positive response from the recipient saying they were impressed with my email. I was indeed quite bold with my words, but it turned out well, as this was for work in activist spaces, which requires some level of ferocity and passion in one's work. Thank you so much. Yeah, so one thing that stands out to me about this, first of all, is just how appropriate networking was for this chart, because the ruler of the ascendant is in the 11th sign. And the other thing that stands out is, I'm not sure if Emily was aware of this feature of the chart, but the moon here is actually conjunct the fixed star Algol. And so when we're doing astrology, there's always many different levels of information that charts are giving us. And one of these layers of information is the layer of the fixed stars, the stars that are past the planets and that they have a fixed zodiacal position relatively. So this star Algol is actually very much a star about rectifying injustice. And so the fact that this is within an activist space that you are networking means that this chart really matches up with your action. And this is one of the cool things that can happen, like regardless of whether or not Emily was aware, sometimes there are features of these charts that you'll be using that you weren't really aware of, like how perfect it was for you until after. So there's this cool way in which elections give a future oriented perspective on your action, where you can kind of tell the story of your action as you're building up to it. And then another way in which retrospect can also be really interesting, like you learn more about astrology and then you look back on your charts and all of these other things click into place. A lot of times we find out why we did something after. So thank you so much, Emily, for sharing this, and I hope that everything goes really well with this person. So now let's get into the charts for the week. Our first chart is January 25th at 8:34 a.m. This is a Pisces rising chart. We've got the moon in Scorpio in a very close trine with Jupiter. And we've got a couple interesting things happening here with a couple planets at 0 degrees of signs. And let's talk about what that means. So with Mars being at 0 degrees of Capricorn, this is in the 11th sign. This is showing some progress, forward motion, momentum, clarity in the realm of alliances. This looks like a great chart for starting to make alliances or preparing yourself to make connections with people who will be supportive of your career. This 0 degree placement of Mars is the very beginning. And so it's not necessarily fully fleshed out, but we can definitely tell that there's some kind of initiation happening with respect to alliances. Sometimes Mars in the 11th house can also indicate a feeling of being outcast or that one doesn't quite fit in any one social category. One thing that you want to check with this chart is the aspect of the moon. So in my location, the moon is very close to this trine with Jupiter, and that's actually the most recent aspect it's made, and its next aspect will be to Venus. And so this moon is enclosed by benefics, it's bona fide. This is like the best kind of Scorpio moon we can get, pretty much. And what we find here in different locations is going to be that the moon is making aspects that are slightly different. For example, you might be in a location where the moon's next aspect is to the sun, and that's going to have a little bit of a different flavor. So just keep in mind what the next aspect of the moon is so that you can kind of work with the energy of that planet more than maybe another one. And so while there is this focus on alliances with Mars just making this ingress into Capricorn in the 11th, this isn't necessarily the chart to be reaching out to individuals for support. This one might be better for something a little bit more public that is not so focused on an individual receiving the message well. And the reason for this is because the ruler of the 7th house, so the planet that represents that other party, is this Mercury who is retrograde at 0 degrees of Aquarius in the 12th house. And so this is a Mercury that does not see Jupiter. Mercury doesn't have access to Jupiter's light. And so even though Jupiter is this incredibly powerful individual presenting themselves and initiating something, Mercury can't see that, and Mercury will likely not appreciate the fullness of what Jupiter has to offer in this case. It might even be the kind of situation where the message just gets lost because of this aversion between Mercury and Jupiter. So if you have something that needs to be a bit more focused on one other person who's being reached out to, then we want to actually look at the next chart, and that is going to be Mercury retrogresses back into Capricorn. So there is now a sign-based aspect between Mercury and Jupiter. So this line of sight, or this line of awareness between the ruler of the 1st and the ruler of the 7th, is indicating that there is recognition of what the ascendant ruler, this Jupiter, has to offer. The message gets seen. The message is read. And we can see this even more so because the moon's next aspect is actually to Mercury. And because the moon is this planet that takes things around and carries around messages to all of the different planets, because it moves so quickly, it's able to make these connections. We can see this aspect from the moon to Mercury, indicating that the other party, this Mercury, is witnessing some kind of information. So this is a decent chart for a 7th house election. It's not the best because this Mercury is still retrograde. And so it might still involve delay in terms of your dealings with this other person, but it is still in the long term probably going to work out just because of that power of Jupiter and the fact that they do see each other. And so what we have now in the 11th house is we have 3 planets. And this makes me think about how a lot of times there are multiple people who you can be communicating with publicly, or multiple people who you might be trying to make alliances with. And there are different ways that you would articulate them yourself. There are different ways that you would articulate yourself to each of these people or each of these groups or individuals. So if we look at what these three planets in the 11th are, we have Mars, Venus, and Mercury. One of these planets is not like the other in the sense that Mars is not retrograde and the other two planets are. And so if we're looking at what is the most supportive thing about this 11th house, it absolutely is this Mars. Mars in the 11th is great for distinguishing oneself within a group. And so what is Mars doing in the 11th house to distinguish itself? Well, we can look at what houses Mars rules, and we see that Mars rules the 2nd and the 9th. So is it this person's philosophy? Is this person's worldview that is distinguishing them within this group? Is it their resources? Because we see Mars also rules the 2nd house. Is it this person's resources that are distinguishing them within a community? By the same token, we can look at what houses Venus rules, and we see that Venus rules the 8th. It's a discomfort with combination, a discomfort with merging. Mars is kind of prodding Venus into action. It's like Venus is getting ready to move forward again, and Mars, who is this like fiery, instigating energy, is coming in and making Venus do a bunch of stuff that Venus might not like to. It will work in the end, but it's going to take some time. One of the overall drawbacks of this day is that the moon is conjunct the south node. So January 26th can be a really powerful day for shedding some things, shedding some attachments, shedding some intensity around philosophical matters, maybe making some compromises. A lot of times I see the south node in terms of purity and this desire for purity that can never really be attained. And so there's a withdrawing from reality because it's not perfect, letting go of a need for a certain kind of perfection. Maybe in this case, it is a philosophical perfection or a perfection of one's worldview, and this recognition that no system of thinking or no whether it's astrology or any other kind of explanatory framework, it is always contextual. You know, we always have to look at what's actually happening, and then our explanations kind of come in after that. But if we think that our system is just perfect, we're really setting ourselves up for disappointment a lot of times. So this day in general, with the moon conjoining the south node, I would say is a day for more introspection. All right, we had 2 Pisces risings already, and I promise this is the last Pisces rising of the week. They are good charts, so sometimes you just gotta roll with what's the best available. And we have January 27th, 8:28 a.m. It is a Pisces rising. The moon is in Sagittarius, moving into an aspect with Jupiter with reception. And everything else is pretty much the same as the previous chart. So what's going on here? We have expanding reputation, expanding visibility. We have these Jupiter themes connected to the 10th sign where the moon is placed. Jupiter is really good for reach. You know, Jupiter is really concerned with how far something can go. How far can we take this idea? How universal can it become before we have to pull it back? And so with the 10th house moon here, we're seeing an expansion around career, an expansion around reputation. This is a pretty good career chart. Now, this is still a complicated chart in terms of the 11th house because we still do have these 2 retrograde planets in the 11th sign. But I would focus more on those things are going to work themselves out. We have all of this power going on in the 1st and the 10th house that is plentiful. You know, there's plenty to go around is the energy that I'm getting. There's plenty to go around is the message that I would emphasize here. So I could see this 11th house being a bit competitive, perhaps. Like there's a lot of voices to be heard over, but the important thing is for your own voice to be the most uplifting. And that while all of those complications get worked out, you can be somebody who's very helpful, and that helpfulness will support your reputation. While there are all of these complicated in process things going on with respect to community and alliances, there's also just as much confidence and self-support and an interest in how far you can go. How far can you take this dream? This is a chart that supports the expansion of that dream and putting it into practice. And so while this is a good career and reputation chart, we can also look to the placement of the sun as a general signifier of career and reputation to give us a little bit more information on what's going on here. And the sun here is in the 12th, in its detriment, and conjunct Saturn. And so what this says to me is that those feelings of positivity that you're projecting in the public space are not always the same ones that you're feeling internally or in private or in secret, or maybe even in ways that you're not fully recognizing. With the 12th house, with this sun here, it makes me think about the way that reputation can sometimes turn into a prison. So our Friday chart for the week is January 28th at 9:32 a.m. And here we have an Aries rising. And so we're going to see some Aries risings for several weeks now while Mars is in Capricorn. And in this specific chart, it is interesting because Mars is exalted in the 10th house. So we're looking at a pretty positive career election, something that's good for advancing one's reputation, for standing out, for making a distinct impact through your career. On the other hand, Mercury and Venus are still retrograde. And so this shows that the kind of career situation that is being addressed by this Mars in Capricorn is a very complicated one. It's one where there's a lot of moving parts still, a lot is still uncertain, and a lot has already been reviewed, and we're getting ready to make a lot of progress. And so you can think of this Mars as kind of like preparing the ground for planting. You know, there's a lot of times you have to break things apart. You have to break apart the soil in order to cultivate it. And so this could look like going out on a limb. You're confident that you can climb the mountain. Mars can often bring us a lot of focus and clarity in a situation where we need to be on, or our sort of battle instincts need to be operating. We need to be able to respond quickly to situations that are uncertain. This is something that Mars is really good at. And so this is an energy that's being presented in the area of careers. So this is a chart where when you take on this election, you're going to be addressing some murky situations with respect to your career, but you are bringing clarity, you're finding clarity, and you're probably the most effective operator out of other people who you're sort of in the same area as, or other people who are in your environment. If we look at what Mars is doing in the 10th house, it's co-present with two planets that are retrograde. So there might be a sense in which this individual, you know, you taking on this action, is kind of instigating other people to get their shit together in a way. This is also an interesting chart as a 7th house election because the ruler of the 7th house is this Venus retrograde in the 10th. And so there's a sense in which Mars and Venus are up to the same thing, but Mars is clearly the one who's calling the shots in this place, while Venus, on the other hand, is a little bit more uncertain or still coming out of something that's been really a trial for Venus. And so this other person might be willing to follow what you're up to or what you're trying to advance with respect to your career because they themselves are a little bit out of gas, and you are asserting yourself as this is where we should go. This, as a relationship election, is not necessarily one where you want to be asking for a lot from the other person, except that they follow you. Okay, our next chart is January 29th, Saturday at 7:13 p.m. So we've got a Virgo rising here. And this is one of the few times where I'll choose an election where the ruler of the ascendant is retrograde, because there's so much else going in the chart that I like. One of those things is the Moon-Venus conjunction. We have this Moon-Venus conjunction in the 5th house, and it's also configured by sextile to Jupiter, where Jupiter is sitting on the descendant. My sort of bulletin board for this chart is saying what you mean even when it's hard. One of the great things about this chart is Jupiter. Jupiter's in its own sign on the descendant. So this is showing that there's some other party who is really engaged and really generous and really wanting to help our own efforts. So we see the 7th house Jupiter along with all of these 5th house planets. So this one definitely has a relationship oriented vibe. I could definitely see this one being used for a really useful conversation, for a relationship to kind of get back on track in some way. It seems as if this conversation has been brewing, and this would be a nice time to have it in a very sober way. And I see this Jupiter on the descendant being a great signature for showing understanding between the people. I think the ascendant ruler, so whoever is sort of initiating this conversation, probably ends up being very anxious about it, but then they are received by this really open heart, this really open-hearted Jupiter who puts them at ease a bit. This is most certainly not an election that I would do for more public matters. We see that there are no planets in the upper hemisphere, with maybe the exception of Jupiter, whose setting will tend to be something that has more to do with private matters, things that are out of public view. This could involve, for example, children. Maybe a conversation that needs to be had with children around setting rules. It could be the case that there's a lot changing with children at the moment, and we need to reestablish certain rules or maybe create new rules in order to accommodate these new realities. One thing to keep in mind with this one is that because the ruler of the ascendant is retrograde, this might be a conversation that needs to happen a second time. There might be some future version of it, or maybe this conversation already has been had, a version of it in the past, that is. Our next chart is also a Virgo rising. It's pretty much the same chart, just 24 hours later. So January 30th, 7:12 p.m. with Jupiter on the descendant. This time, the moon is conjunct Mercury. So this one's a little bit different, a little bit less focused on Venus and a little bit more focused on the ascendant ruler themselves. So I would go for this one for anything to do with like creative writing, or maybe revisiting past creative projects and revising them or planning them. Like, okay, I have all of this material. What am I going to do with it from here? How does it all fit together? If it's not super organized, what is the organizational structure that needs to happen in order for it to be successful in the long run? This could also be another very collaborative chart where maybe you're working with another person very closely, somebody who's wise and somebody who can really see the big picture like Jupiter and can share that insight with you in order for you to improve what you're working on. Everything about the January 29th chart in terms of children also applies here. All of the same themes are still there. There's just more emphasis in this chart on the ascendant ruler, so the individual undertaking the action, having a light shown on them in some way. Like this moon is conjoining this Mercury. And so there's a sense in which Mercury is receiving a lot of information or gathering a lot of input from others. This Mercury could also feel very attuned to the body and being able to write or create from a place of deep embodiment. And our final chart for the week is January 31st at 9:55 a.m. It's another Aries rising. This one's a little bit different because Venus is direct at this point. And so what we've done here is put Venus on the midheaven. So this becomes an even better chart than the previous one for reputation because we've got this 10th house benefic. We're in the balsamic moon phase here, which is where the moon gets very close to the sun and it's getting ready to be a new moon. This particular new moon is a little bit trickier because it doesn't have any support from benefics. If we look at where the benefics are relative to Aquarius, where the new moon is taking place, the benefics are in the signs right next to the new moon. And so there's actually not a lot of contact with it. Meanwhile, the new moon is taking place conjunct Saturn. Personally, I will be avoiding this day for any major announcements. A new moon like this, I'm definitely trying to keep to myself. Saturn itself is prone to isolation anyway. I could see this having something to do with maybe wrapping up or completing some kind of community engagement, sort of well wishes until next time kind of thing. With Venus culminating like this, it does have that sense of niceties or even expressing sincere appreciation for everybody's participation. Sometimes the moon in this phase is also useful for doing things in secret. So if you have something that you want to do in secret with respect to a community or an organization, like one of these 11th house bodies, then this might be an interesting chart to use for that. The darkness of the moon can be said to correspond with things that happen in the dark or out of sight. And we also have Mercury stationing direct in the 10th house. A Mercury retrograde in the 10th house can absolutely bring about changes in direction with communication. So like people changing opinions, people being swayed. There's something quite persuasive about this chart. I think it would just have to be behind closed doors. Thanks so much to everybody again for joining me on this episode of Elections Weekly. In typical Mercury retrograde fashion, I no longer have access to the camera and microphone setup that I had for the first 2 episodes. So I have to get a new one, and that's a pretty significant expense. So I would really appreciate any contributions that y'all who are appreciating this content would be willing to make at that link. And as always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. That kind of support is so appreciated as well. Obviously, let me know how your work with these elections go, and I'd love to feature your comments in future videos like I did with Mackenzie and Emily today. Hope everybody has an awesome week, and I will see you in February. Bye.